Hello, y'all, and welcome to this rootin' season of Homescreen. We have an exciting semester ahead. We are going to be trying out a lot of different things, and we will see what sticks and what doesn't stick and what I do poorly. By the way, which arm? This new tattoo, baby! Very exciting. Now, without any further yapping, let's just start the show.
Let's go!
Now, let's talk about some of these hot goss games. Coming out on October 4th is Warhammer 4000 Darktide, a mouthful. Set in the famous Warhammer setting, Darktide is a first-person action game. You will be able to create a character out of one of the four classes and battle enemies with friends and allies. This game has already come out on Windows, but comes to the Xbox consoles in October. Next, the day after, October 5th, sees the release of the long-anticipated Assassin's Creed Mirage. This game is returned to form for the series, placing more emphasis back on stealth and less on RPG elements like the previous entries. You will play as Basim, there we go, got it third time, in 9th century Baghdad as you fight the evil Templar Order. We hate those guys. It will come out on all major consoles and even some minor ones. Finally, just in time for Halloween, Alan Wake 2, baby, comes out October 27th on the two major consoles, Xbox and PS5. I don't know what the newest Xbox is called. As well as Windows, which if you have a PC is exciting, but if you don't, like me, you don't care. Alan Wake 2 sees you return to the typewriter of author Alan Wake, obviously, who has been trapped in a dark dimension for 13 years, like when we were in the pandemic. You will also play as new character, FBI agent Sega Anderson. This one I'm personally excited for. I didn't play the first game, but I really liked Control, and Control is very good, so I'm excited to try this one out. Now, after the break, I will be talking about my favorite game of all time, Disco Elysium. Don't touch the dial, stay tuned. Welcome back to Homescreen, my friends. Tonight's main story is about Disco Elysium. Just from the top, I will say that I am going to try and avoid huge spoilers. A huge part of this rant will be discussing aspects of the game that could be considered spoilers. If you haven't had the chance to play Disco Elysium, close this video now and play it, please. You will not regret it. It's a great game. I promise it is amazing. With that being said, once again, spoilers ahead. Let's move on to our first slide. First off, what is Disco Elysium? Well, as it says right there, it's a detective RPG. Now, seeing that title might make you think the game is more simple than it actually is. Tonight, I'm going to talk extensively about many aspects of the game and just the love I hold for this game. By the end of the show, we should be able to answer what Disco Elysium is. That's right, this is like a high school persuasive essay. We love it here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is this man right here, this beautiful man right here. This is the character you play as. It's the man I want to talk about. You are a cop that wakes up after an intense bender, which I don't know what that is. I'm a child. You don't remember anything from your previous life, not even your own name. So for now, we'll just call this lovely fellow Sunset. Now, this man, you gotta love him. I mean, just take a second to take in. Disco Elysium has some beautiful art, a lot of oil painting inspired for the character portraits, and even just the game itself is really what they did is they created like 3D environments and they painted over it, which creates this really kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's very Eastern European, if that makes sense, because the creators are Ukrainian, I believe. So you definitely get that from the art style. And then, I mean, I don't know who this man's name is. I'll have to bleep that in post because I didn't want to spoil the name. But Sunset here is just a great character. You really start off as what you think is a blank slate. You think Amnesia is like cliched or whatever to start off a protagonist with. But really, as you go through the game, you realize it's much more complex about that. The game has a lot to say about like cycles of abuse and trauma and unhealthy coping methods that make Sunset here more than just a person, your insert character, which is really beautiful. And depending on how you play him, you can have either a really sad story but thematically appropriate, or you can have a really like moving healing story that it also feels thematically appropriate. And that's all due to like the history of this character. Again, I'm not going to go into too much depth because I don't want to spoil anything, because literally at the beginning of the game you don't know anything, so any information is a spoiler for the game. But it's just so beautiful, and the character is, I mean, I'll talk on this more later when I talk about all the characters, but this character is just so well-rounded and more than what you think he is. So after talking about that, we'll move on to our next slide, which is our next section about the skills in the game. Now this is pretty basic for RPGs. You have to have skills when you create a character. And what I think really sets Disco Elysium apart in its skills is that it is not the traditional skills you get in RPG. I mean, not to spoil anything about the gaming aspects of it, but Disco Elysium does not have a combat system. All it is rolling 2d6s and adding whatever appropriate bonuses or subtracting whatever appropriate bonuses to that. And I think what the 4 main skills represent is really interesting, because you have 2 skills that are almost of the mind, which are these 2 on the top, and then you have 2 skills that are of the body, if that makes sense, on the bottom. But how they differ is really interesting, because you have, I forget, it's intellect. So intellect is this top one here, and that has to do more with like logical skills, a lot of like thinking through. That's a very like almost physical part of the brain, which I find really interesting, because you have like the sub-skills, which are there are 25 sub-skills, which is really, really interesting how each thing differ. The sub-skills of intellect all have to do with like logic, encyclopedia, rhetoric, you know, like very like what you think of like smart stuff is, which I think is really interesting, especially when compared to like what the other mind skill is, which is it's like psychics. I don't remember, it's been a while, but it's like, it has to do with more psychology in the more ephemeral parts of the brain. So you have things like empathy or inland empire, which is basically imagination. So they have that really interesting contrast between like almost physical parts of the brain and metaphysical parts of the brain. And you also see that with the 2 body skills, which are physicality and motorics. Motorics are, again, like that ephemeral part of the body. You have hand-eye coordination, perception, kind of like senses in that way. And then you have physicality, which is more about that physical aspect, physical aspects of the body, which also has to do with some senses. But you also get things like endurance, obviously, which is how much the body can take. But you have interesting things like shivers, which is almost the most explicitly magical, quote unquote, aspect of the game, and what shivers is and what it represents, and how it like it's so weird, but it's so cool to talk about. You have to play a game listening to shivers, because it's just so interesting, especially the prose of the game. It's very cool. The last thing I will say about skills is that when you create a character, you obviously put a certain amount of points into each one. That will be your bonus to it. Everything in that category gets that bonus, and then you can level up to get more bonuses in certain sub-skills. But when you create your character, you actually choose what is called a king skill. So when I did my first playthrough, my king skill was Inland Empire. So my Sunset was very imaginative. He had that kind of like very, I don't want to say childish, but like that very like imaginative way of looking at the world that actually proved to be very useful in a lot of situations. So I just thought the way Disco Elysium does these skills is different than other RPGs, but it is also like so thematically appropriate. I know I just said the last thing I'd say about skills was that thing, but I also just want to bring up one more thing. Skills talk to you. They act as your party in the game pretty much, which is so interesting because depending on what skills you put more time into, the more they will talk to you, which gives you an interesting perspective into Sunset's mind and how he interprets like those events. And I just think there's so much that Disco Elysium does that's different than other RPGs while still being based on those core aspects. So we'll move on to our next slide, which is semi-related to skills. This is another big gameplay mechanic, and these are thoughts. Now, as you go through the game, you'll complete certain actions, certain requirements, and you'll basically unlock the ability to have a thought, which sounds very weird when you remove it from the context of the game. But having this thought basically allows Sunset, the character, to mull over that aspect of their previous life or whatever they're experiencing now. And after you work through that thought, you can add it to your thought cabinet, and that will give you bonuses or minuses to certain aspects and checks. Like there's some aspects that will give you more strength but less empathy or whatever. So like it'll be like you've learned that this is a harsh world or whatever, there's no time for empathy. So that's really interesting. And another interesting thoughts can do is there's some that don't offer bonuses, but just give information about your character. It's basically your character remembering stuff from their previous lives, which is really interesting to go through and like have a gameplay mechanic be about memory and remembering and thoughts. That it's just so interesting how it interacts with your character and how it can interact with your world. Certain thoughts also give you different dialogue choices, which is just, it's crazy the amount of writing that goes into this game. It's one of the most, I think it's like the longest game in terms of writing ever. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's true. I remember like the main voice actor recorded more lines than were in like The Lord of the Rings, which is crazy. Even though I haven't watched those movies, I've heard they're very big. So that's about all I have to say about thoughts. Next, I want to move on to characters, man. Characters, you gotta love them. First, we gotta talk about Kim Kitsurugi. He's your like partner throughout this case. And Kim is the love of my life. He is the best man I've ever met, the best man I've ever seen. He's such a good contrast to your character and his personality and how he treats things. He comes off at first as a more straight-laced cop, but as you go through the story, you learn that he's not actually as straight-laced as he first appears or as he wants to present himself to be. He has these kind of interesting thoughts as well and things about himself that he kind of pushes down to exist in the world that he is in, which is beautiful. And obviously, he's just a joy to be around. I mean, he's probably the best party member in any RPG I've ever played. As I said, love of my life. He's just so great. I wish I could be around him all the time. And there's so much just great like jokes that he tells that are just deadpan. And you're like, you just said something so weird and you're acting like it's nothing, Kim. It's just great. And also he looks really cool. And you gotta love that from a character. We'll move from this slide into my next slide, which is about all of these characters. As you can see, the lovely oil painting style that Disco Elysium has for its character portraits. I've had to black out some for spoilers. I think I got everyone that was a spoiler. I could be wrong about that, but I should have. It's not important. But there's a lot of great characters. I won't talk about every single one of them because there's a lot. And obviously there's some of the spoilers, and a lot of the more complex, a lot of the more like interesting characters are spoilers, and I don't want to talk about them here because I want you to experience that churn more. So I won't talk about even the most important characters, but I'll talk about a few that I really like, starting with, here, I'm gonna move over here. This man right here, Everett, he is the union boss at a dockers union that is in the game that is currently on strike. And his character is so interesting because he presents himself, I should say, almost like a mob boss in how the game wants you to think about him. But as you peel back the layers, you realize that's like a front to his actual personality, his actual goals. And it's just so interesting to have this character that almost seems cartoonishly villainous. And you realize that you peel back the layers and look at the context of the situation. And you're like, oh no, he's just a guy that wants, I mean, not always through ethical means, but he wants what's best for his union workers. And he's talking to a cop. He's not gonna be honest. He's not gonna be like forthright. And it's just so interesting that he's presented in a way that he truly is not, or that he's more complex, which I think shows such a great aspect of this game, is that every character is not a stereotype. They are a fully complex person with their own methodologies of moving through a world that is often very harsh. Next person I want to talk about is Joyce here. Joyce is great because she is both so like cynically wise while also being a massive hypocrite. She's awesome in that like she's like, this is how the world is and it sucks and this is bad, but I'm benefiting from it, so I'm not going to do anything about it. And you're like, okay, Joyce, you're honest about who you are, will also be just like bad. And it's great. She's a great character. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a thing she does near the end of the game where it's like, of course she would do that, but I didn't expect her to do that because she charmed me. I mean, she made me think she was like better than she was, but of course she would do that thing. So I think that's Joyce and Everett especially are just great characters because they're basically on opposing sides of the strike. So it's beautiful character work. Down here, probably less important characters right here. These are the cryptozoologists. Cryptozoology, for those who don't know, is basically the study of cryptids, kind of like a pseudoscience. Although, who wouldn't love if cryptids are real? Personally, I would love if cryptids were real. Are they? No, but I'd love if they were. And the cryptozoologists are like not involved with story at all, pretty much. Nothing in their storyline matters in the actual grand scheme, but they have a little side quest about like trying to prove the existence of a cryptid, and it's just so heartfelt and like such great character work on both parts of them. And there's just like this heartbreaking story of this couple and how this cryptid is both very important to them for like sentimental reasons, while also being like it's driving them to try and find it, even though they both admit it's probably not real. So those are just 4 characters I wanted to point out. They are by no means the most important or the most interesting on this list, but I can't talk about anyone else without spoiling. And the point of this is to spoil enough stuff so you're interested in actually playing the game. So after we talk about these characters, we'll move on to my next slide here. Now this is all about the world. The world of Disco Elysium is so interesting. The actual world is called Elysium, which actually obviously comes from ancient Greece and that paradise. And it's so interesting because it's very much not a paradise. An interesting fact about Disco Elysium actually is it started as a TTRPG setting, a tabletop role-playing setting. I believe it was D&D, but I could be wrong about that. And what's so great about it is it's just obviously been in somebody's mind for so long. There's entire countries with this deep history and lore and all these people. It's like, I've never watched Game of Thrones, but the way people describe Game of Thrones and how R.R. Martin like has all this history and depth and lore to each character and country and place, that's what Disco Elysium is like. There's so much stuff in this game that you can just never find out about that is just so interesting to do with the different countries in the world and how these things interact. The most interesting thing, I think, is that you can go this entire game without ever finding out about the Pale. And the Pale is like the most important thing in the world of Elysium. And you can just not know about it, which is crazy to me. Because the Pale is essentially like this fog of nothingness, like matter, laws of physics break down in the Pale, and people have to send out like radio signals and travel through blimps to get through it. And it's just never mentioned. And it's like a really bad thing, but it's just never mentioned in the game unless you specifically seek it out. And I think that's another great thing about this game is that like you can interact with the world as much as you want to. You can know nothing about the world, like Sunset, or you can learn everything about it, and it doesn't matter basically to the story. It's just for you. And I love that. I love reading stuff in games. I love basically just treating games as books. I got asked recently, the last thing I read was, I was honestly tempted to say Disco Elysium instead of a book. I was like, there was a moment where I was like, Disco Elysium? And I was like, no, that'd be really weird. So I didn't, and I just made up a book. But it's just great. And honestly, just read the Wikipedia if you don't want to play the game, but play the game. We'll move on to my next section here. This section, oh boy, we're gonna talk about politics in the game, in the world of the game. Now this is very interesting. Like I said, every country, every place has this in-depth lore to it, and like this is a real world, real complex. There are politics in this and different systems of governance and how people think how the world should work, basically. One big thing to know about the setting you are in, the place you're in, is that you are in a country that's previously ruled by a communist, the communards, before they were destroyed by the current world government, the Moralitarian, which are these guys, which basically are the administrators of the world now. And it's just so interesting that they have this in-depth lore about like all these different real political factions and how that ideology works in this fictional world. Now, I have these 4 lovely portraits here, and that's to illustrate the 4 main ideologies in the game. You have moralism, fascism, ultraliberalism, and communism. No, those are real ideologies, and I'm not read enough in theory to adequately explain them all. But in the world of the game, moralism is basically like centrism. It's about being like, everything is great, or let's just talk it out. And it's like, but the world is falling apart, and it's like, well, the status quo is benefiting me, so it's fine. And it's like, okay, not really great. Fascism, we all know what fascism is, hopefully. If not, you should read a history book, because it's something you should know about. Please know about fascism. It's a bad thing you should know about. Fascism is, in this game, is basically all about how things used to be. I mean, that's pretty classic for fascism, but how things used to be, the old kingdom of Revachol, which is the setting, and about like, almost like not bad nostalgia, but like this nostalgia of a time that never really exists, which isn't that the story of every book ever. You have ultraliberalism, which is basically just all about capitalism. We know capitalism is the thing we live under, and is so fun and good. Not to be political. But ultraliberalism is actually not, it doesn't interact too much with the game, aside from obviously you buy stuff. Joyce is an ultra-liberal from a few slides back, but it's interesting, especially when composed to communism, which is the final ideology I'll talk about. Communism in this is really interesting because of who current communists are and who the old communists are. Because, like I said before, the country that you exist in, especially the city, used to be ruled by communists, but they got destroyed, and now it's kind of like sad everywhere because things are not good. And it's interesting because this character is Stefan, the student communist, and he is like a new communist because he's in university, he's doing theory stuff. And he is a common critique of communists and leftists in general, obviously, is that they're all involved with theory. They're all book guys, and they're not about action. And Stefan is very much like that. And so it's interesting. There's interesting critiques of each ideology. But what I find especially interesting about Stefan and his storyline is that there is a moment near the end of it where all that kind of theory and that political ideology kind of, slides away. And you kind of talk about the core of what your ideology is and why Stefan is a communist. And he has this beautiful quote, honestly, genuinely moving. I cried when I read it. There's this beautiful quote that he says, and it's, "In dark times, should the stars also go out," which is just a beautiful core of what he believes communism is, which is just hope that the dark times won't last, that there is a future. And it's just so beautiful to have that moment of moving away from all that complex theory and being like, this is what, at my core, this is why I believe what I believe. It's because I want the world to be better. So I just think there's so much beautiful political commentary in that, and also exploration of these ideas in a world that's different than ours, which is something that we don't see too often, I feel like. Like, you've never read a fantasy series and they've been like, we gotta stop Sauron, the evil fascist leader, and whoa, we're just throwing words in now. But I think it's so cool and it really fits in the setting we're in. We'll move on to my next slide, my second to last slide. And this is about the plot. Now, obviously, I had to talk around this because I'm trying to be vague and not spoilers, but I put a few images up of just our lovely protagonist in his beautiful tie. And I just want to briefly talk about what the plot is. The plot hook, at least, aside from you waking up with no memory, is that there was a murder, no way to talk around that, and that you were sent to basically solve, because as a detective RPG, obviously, it's like a murder mystery. But the like reasons behind it and the people involved. There's just so many complexities to it that you just peel back layer after layer, and you're like, why did they do this? And it's just so interesting because you can finish the game without ever finding out the true reason. You can just be like, okay, all the pieces are clicking together in a way that makes sense, so I'm just going to accuse the person and the game is over. But if you really dig deep and you can keep on digging, you can find out the real reason. And it's just so interesting because it's like a rug pull from your expectations of what these kind of stories do and how these stories conclude, and like why somebody is killed, why, like the motivations behind it. And it's just so interesting how that simple plot, it just expands into a million different things, to where like at the end of the game, the main central like plot line I didn't really care about. It was the least like important thing probably. Everything else and all the characters were so complex, I cared about that more. But you had this like interesting moment at the end where you finally like solve it, and it's not satisfying in a good way. It's not satisfying in a good way. And I think that's really at the core of what Disco Elysium is, as we move into my final slide here, is that Disco Elysium is not a story with a satisfying ending, quote unquote. It's a story about real and complex people that obviously life doesn't have a satisfying ending. You don't feel like, even if you solve the actual murder, you don't feel like you're some hero who's solved everything. You solved a murder in a world that's falling apart and so many people are being hurt. You like just expanding out from that single context, you realize I didn't really actually change anything. That is, you mainly focus on the murder. However, it is possible in this game to help a lot of people in this town that you're in. And even though that doesn't have an effect on the wider world, you still helped these people in a meaningful way. And I think it's really beautiful in that like you can make individual change and it still means something even if you didn't fix the world, you didn't solve everything. So Disco Elysium's ending isn't satisfying, quote unquote, but it is also satisfying in certain ways if you play it certain ways, and how you affect the people around you instead of just how you affect the world. So I think that's a big reason. These are a lot of the reasons I love Disco Elysium, and that is a big one. And I just want to say, you know, your character cannot save the world in the game. It's not possible. You can help a few people, but if you play it right, you come out better. You come out with new friends, new allies, in a better place than you were before. And maybe, just maybe, you can have more power in the future to cause real change in some ways, like Le Retour, which if you play the game, you'll learn more about, but it's just a really interesting concept that has nothing to do that exists within the game, but it's something really interesting to think about. So that is all my presentation on Disco Elysium and why it's great and why you should play it. We're gonna take a quick little break for me to catch my breath, but we will be right back, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Homescreen. We're really trying something new. I've playfully dubbed this semester the Chaos semester because I'm going to be trying a lot of different things. I hope you enjoyed this, like a lot of me talking about what I like, but I hope that is interesting because I always find it interesting to listen to people talk about things they like. That's why video essays are a thing. I don't care about that thing, but I care about people who care about it. So that's a lot of fun. You should now want to play Disco Elysium. In fact, you do now want to play Disco Elysium. It's only $40. You can buy it. It's a great game. There's just so much. There's so much. It's the best game I've ever played. I'm at a loss for words. How I was thinking about it so much earlier today, putting this together. I was just like overwhelmed by how much I liked it. So that's my little rant for today. But be sure to check out all of our other TV10 stuff, both at mytv10.uwec.edu or our TV10 YouTube account, which has a bunch of videos cut up, really fun. We also have an Instagram and a TikTok. Just search up UWEC TV10 on there. And I don't think we have anything else. We don't have a Pinterest, but Pinterest is good. Maybe we should get one. But be sure to check all that out. That's all I have to say. I've done all the damage I can do. Good night and good games.